Journalists often tell a compelling story, get the audience interested, but then people are left wondering what happened next. Tonight, we're following up. The Investigators starts now.
And now CBC News has learned the identity of another young Calgarian who left, fought, and died.
When I arrived in Calgary, we were like, oh my God, he's here to report on a negative story once again.
Juliana St. Peter is buried in a cemetery alongside the St. John River. She would have been 15 years old this year.
And the message that we're getting from the public is that they think this matters. They think it's important.
The CHL says that its teams cannot afford to pay players.
At the root of it, journalism is about trying to give people who don't have any power a voice.
I'm Diana Swain. We're the Investigators. This is what we do. It's the job of any journalist, not just to break stories, but to follow them up. Often, though, a reporter's time and attention is overtaken by other stories, and the follow-up is forgotten. Tonight, some examples of journalists who kept at it and what they discovered. We begin in Alberta with CBC News reporting that began 4 years ago about a group of men who left Calgary radicalized and ready to fight for extremist groups like ISIS.
Is he actually picking up a gun? Is he actually shooting and harming people?
The mother of Damien Claremont, a young Canadian killed in Syria, speaking to CBC News in 2014. Her son, one of 8 young men who left Calgary to join militant groups overseas. This week, CBC News learned another of them has been killed. Only one is believed to still be alive.
So I saw them a couple of times, but I never saw anything firsthand that would arise my suspicion.
The group attended a Calgary mosque led by Imam Naved Aziz. It permanently closed its doors this week.
We celebrated people's births in this mosque, but then there was this dark element that just lingered over it, that overshadowed and overpowered all these amazing experiences.
Aziz has himself been investigated by police. It says he's now trusted by law enforcement as an ally in countering radicalism. CBC News producer Nazim Baksh has been investigating domestic radicalization for years, and this week was part of the team following up on what's happened in Alberta. Naz, you and I have known each other a long time. I know you've been working on this story a long time. Talk about the value of following up in a story.
Well, the stories that have to do with national security they don't have any narrow time span. So when you start working on stories and you realize back in those days, intelligence services, police were saying it's not only men going abroad and fighting that is a danger to Canada, but potentially coming back. And what happens to them? And so that potential to come back or to radicalize others and close that story is virtually impossible. Stories like that don't really close. So 3 years later, I'm sitting at my desk and thinking, what happened to Forrest Sheridan, who burnt his passport and threatened Canada and said to Obama, I'm coming for you? What happened to him? There's no report. There are no reports of his death. Is he still alive? What's going on there? And so that forces us to sort of look again, make some calls, see what's going on.
And what's interesting, too, is the story this week shows a kind of an evolution for the Imam that we heard from, who now sees himself as part of the effort to stop this radicalization. Why is it important to share that?
Because back in the days when we would call the mosque administration, wanting to speak to the Imam, wanted to speak to elders in the community, nobody wanted to talk to us. They were lost. They were fumbling around in the dark, perhaps, looking for answers. We had very little answers. So we're thinking there must be somebody accountable in the community to speak with. So when we kind of realized this Imam is now speaking and he's talking about his experience with these young men, we thought, let's go listen to what he has to say. And it's an amazing transformation because he's now empowered. He's no longer a suspect, a radicalizer. Back in the days, we were looking, maybe somebody radicalized these men, right? Little did we know that they were meeting in secret, above the mosque. Nobody knew what they were studying. No scholar was there to overlook their work or whatever the case was. And there is this Imam now saying, I was really at loss how these guys ended up, becoming radicalized to join a terrorist organization abroad. So from that perspective, he became an important player.
What's it been like for you as a Muslim man doing stories within this community? Does it make it easier or more challenging?
Well, at first, when I started working on the story, I could enter the mosque. I can go and sit there and listen, and after the prayer, goes privately speak with the imam. And I found that that allows me, but by being Muslim, it still allows me some degree of access to people, while other reporters might be staked out outside. I can go and pray, and I would normally go and pray anyways, right? If there's a prayer, if I'm at the mosque at a prayer time. But when I went back to Calgary a week ago, I realized that people saw me and they're like, okay.
It's the reporter, the journalist. What's
going on? Is there something else you're coming to report? And people tend to share information if they trust you. And so, if I'm a CBC producer, and I've been a CBC producer for a long time. There are times when people, sort of might instigate or allege that maybe he works for CSIS or the RCMP or something like that. He knows too much. And there was like a shadow over my personality when I arrived in Calgary. People were like, oh my God, he's here to report on a negative story once again. Because when I was working with Adrian Arsenault, we were doing 1, 2, 3 every month. We were practically in Calgary doing these stories. Edmonton, London, Ontario, Windsor, Timmins, Ottawa, Montreal. I mean, it was one after the next, right? But Calgary got the brunt of it because they were known as the jihadi enclave of Canada because of these cluster of about a dozen men. So many of them went off to fight and die in Syria and Iraq.
Interesting to talk to you. Thanks for this.
Nice talking to you, too.
We're also following up on a CBC News investigation in New Brunswick that we told you about a few weeks ago. CBC News journalists spent 3 years trying to get information about children who've died while in the government's care or with families known to be at risk.
The government said, no, you can't see these reports. They say we can't see the reports because it would violate privacy law.
That meant the deaths of dozens of children have not been publicly explained. So CBC journalists tracked down family members and public officials to try to piece together a clearer picture of what happened.
She's always there, like in the back of my mind, like, what if I'd have stayed there? What if I hadn't come out here to Alberta? Would she still be alive?
The investigation determined at least 53 children known to child protection officials have died from unnatural causes in the past 2 decades. The reporting has now led to calls for more transparency from the New Brunswick government.
We just can't give that information out. There's laws.
Can you change the law?
If we sit down with people and look at better ways of doing things, we'll certainly be open to that.
Carissa Donkin is one of the producers who's been working on this story. Carissa, good to have you join us again. Tell us what's happened since this investigation rolled out.
Right. So the last time we spoke, what we were hearing from government is we can't talk about this. There's privacy legislation that's preventing us from saying anything about how these children died. And that's sort of the message that we were getting at first from government is, these are old cases that you're talking about for the most part, and we're doing great work here, and you're not recognizing that. But about a week after we started telling these stories, that kind of started to change a little bit. So what we started hearing from government is, okay, maybe we can improve the process. So as of right now, we haven't had any kind of specific promises from government to make any changes or tell us more information. But for the first time, and I think this is really significant, they are recognizing that the public wants to know how at-risk children are dying. And since we've started telling these stories, they've actually given us a little bit more information about those 53 children that you just mentioned.
What role, in your view, has the public response to these stories played in the government's response?
I think it's played a big role. I know we have heard a lot from the public since we started putting these stories out. We've gotten emails and Facebook messages and calls. We've even heard from some family members that we'd never spoken to before. And the message that we're getting from the public is that they think this matters. They think it's important, and they want more transparency from government. We also spoke to the province's child and youth advocate, and he described it as a public outcry. So he is hearing a little bit of this as well. And I don't know what government is hearing, but I would presume they're getting some of these same messages from their constituents.
Very briefly, can you tell us what you expect to be next in this?
Yeah, so what we know so far is that government is now open to telling us a little bit more about how these children died. We don't know what form that's going to take. So we know that they're going to sit down with the province's Access to Information Commissioner, the Child and Youth Advocate, and talk about how to move forward with it. So we're hopeful that some of these details that have been secret for so long will no longer be secret someday.
Carissa, thanks for this.
Thank you for having me.
There's a pass. It's a good one.
We're also digging into a battle in junior hockey that's playing out off the ice. Some players are earning less than $50 a week. They want a raise.
Says if it's forced to pay them, the league will have to scale back other benefits such as
what TSN's Rick Westhead has uncovered and the challenges of investigative journalism in sports. Plus,
how many soldiers did you lose?
New details about attempts to rescue 2 Canadians held hostage in the Philippines last year. Our weekly roundup of what we learned from investigative journalism this week is next. But first, the Conservative Party leadership race.
Well, public service called again.
We're in the home stretch now, and the candidates are making their final pitches on video.
I want to give back to this country.
Some look pretty good. Others, well...
But we do need to change the way that we connect with Canadians.
And Canada is a place where we can each choose how we wish to live.
Where are they looking? They're not the only ones with some strange camera work.
Of nuclear-fueled waste coming from the Kendall reactors.
I think the camera person fell asleep here. At least he has a camera person.
As a leader who understands Canada from the bottom up.
Okay, to be fair, they want to be prime minister, not TV stars. So surely the candidate with hit TV shows can pull this off, right?
No question about that. But in particularly remote areas.
Well, clearly Rick Mercer makes walking and ranting look a lot easier than it is. So, candidates, if you are bent on making an unorthodox video and getting some attention, here's some inspiration. One of the best ads we've ever seen.
Gerald really doesn't have any hobbies.
Last year's tax rate was 0.4169.
From a man seeking re-election as a county commissioner in the U.S.
Please re-elect Gerald. Please.
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. CBC News reported that the federal government will announce new legislation in April that will make the sale of marijuana legal by July 1st, 2018. The New York Times learned the Trump administration has relaxed some of the rules that prevent civilian casualties during U.S. military operations against militant groups in Somalia. The Pentagon confirmed Trump has given it expanded authority to target militants in the East African country. CBC News reported some engineer trainees at Canadian Pacific Railway told the company they felt ill-prepared to operate trains on dangerous mountain routes, but were promoted anyway. CP says its training program is state-of-the-art. A Chinese cyber attack on the National Research Council's computer infrastructure cost Ottawa hundreds of millions of dollars. That's according to a government document obtained by the Globe and Mail. And the Philippine military told CBC News that roughly 30 of its soldiers died trying to rescue 2 Canadians being held hostage by a militant Islamist group in 2016. Robert Hall and John Ridsdale were beheaded by the jihadist group Abu Sayyaf. There was a time when many reporters viewed sports journalism as an oxymoron, suggesting that many reporters would never bite the hand that feeds them by digging into sacred territory. In fact, sports reporters have been behind some pretty big investigative headlines.
Gets it to Blake Wheeler, who beats Laurent Bourgeois.
This is what generally comes to mind when people think of sports journalism, the nightly roundup of scores and highlights.
Loses the handle, recovers, yeah.
But Rick Westhead knows there's much more to it than that. Westhead is a senior correspondent for TSN, an award-winning investigative journalist. He's reported on everything from the long-term effects of concussions on NHL players,
long-term effects of brain injuries,
to the use of performance-enhancing drugs by amateur athletes looking to make it big.
The pressure of sports is so big that you're going to do whatever you can to get that competitive edge.
His latest reporting has focused on a legal battle over money, one that could radically change daily life for junior hockey players.
A lawsuit filed by current and former players who want to be paid at least a minimum wage. The players say they have received as little as $50 a week.
I think what it's going to do is make the clubs realize that they have to respect players' employment rights.
You know, Rick, I would consider myself a pretty passionate sports fan. I had no idea these players are virtually not paid.
No, they're not. And, you know, at the root of it, journalism, in my mind, and I think probably yours too, is about trying to give people who don't have any power a voice. And junior hockey players across the country clearly fit that description. You know, you have players who come up through a system, they end up playing for teams that are for-profit enterprises that are making millions of dollars in revenue, but you still have owners saying, hey, we can't afford to pay players because if we do, we're going to go out of business. So it just almost begs for journalists to dig into those numbers and see just how true those claims are.
Now, your background really began in news. You were in foreign postings for newspapers. Now you find yourself in this very exclusive club, perhaps being one of the only sports investigative journalists in this country. But that's a smaller pond to play in. You're going to be running into these people that you're covering much more frequently. Does that make the job more difficult?
I would say it's not an easy job. It's, you know, obviously it's not easy to confront Gary Bettman when every other reporter in the room wants to talk about, you know, good news stories for the league, or at least seems to. Are they going to the Olympics or not? That's a story that the NHL can manage very well. But when you're confronting the commissioner at a breakfast like we just saw in Nashville at the All-Star game, and you're telling him that you've talked to retired players who are now struggling through early onset dementia, who don't have enough money to call 911 because when they have a seizure and they need to go to the hospital, they can't afford to pay the ambulance to take them there. That's a bit of a different situation, and it really does put you on the outs with these leagues very quickly if you pursue, you know, repeated stories.
And it's such a disconnect with what most of us attached to pro sports, which is nothing but money and largesse, and look how well they're living. Does that say then that the world of sports in general needs more scrutiny for all of us to get a clearer picture of what the reality is for many of these players across very different kinds of sports?
Well, I think so, and only because sports is just another industry like any other. We have reporters who cover you know, the auto industry and the tech industry and all levels of government in Canada. Sports on its own is $1 billion industry. We know that every year the National Hockey League generates $4 billion. So that begs for more critical reporting.
So why hasn't that happened, do you think? Why isn't this a beat that exists everywhere and in an aggressive way?
I don't know. I think maybe the changing nature of media right now, newspapers have all scaled back. You know, you're starting to see some of them aren't even sending their reporters on road trips with teams.
Right.
And truth is, it takes time. So you might have a reporter say, well, I can file a story on the team practice today and talk about Austin Matthews with the Toronto Maple Leafs breaking a rookie scoring record. It's much faster to deliver that story than for me to dig into a story, for instance, on whether NHL team doctors have a conflict of interest, because on one hand, they're trying to give players the best medical advice they can about when they should return to action and to the ice. On the other hand, they're also reporting and working for team owners who have a vested interest in trying to get those guys right back on the ice.
Well, good on TSN for investing in it, and good on you for doing it.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. A big scandal in the U.S. culminates with jail time for 2 political aides. My POV and this week's Ask Me Anything are next. First, investigators on assignment.
I'm Adrienne Arsenault in Manila. The phenomenon of fake news and online attacks here in the Philippines makes the North American version look almost quaint. Creating false content here is an entire industry. Getting to the truth is uniquely difficult. Fact-checking is sometimes so slow, so expensive, many people don't even bother trying, and the consequences are huge. Faking it in the Philippines. That's coming up soon on The Investigators.
Got a story tip for the investigators? Share it anonymously at securedrop.cbc.ca. You can also reach us through email. That's investigators@cbc.ca, or just reach out to us on Twitter at Swain Diana. You're watching The Investigators on CBC News Network. Part of what we aim to do with this program is to demystify investigative journalism, talk to you about the work that we do. And one of the ways we do that is have you ask me anything. So this week we have a question from Bailey, and she wants to know, How do you know when to fight for a story and when to let it go? Bailey, timing is everything. I've actually been struggling with this very thing this week. There's a story that I'm really keen on. A couple of my colleagues are as well. Some others aren't. And I've been trying to push the story forward this week, but not getting a whole lot of traction. And that's the reality of it. Journalism is a team sport. It's not about one person's point of view, pushing it forward all the way to getting their story on the air. It has to be a reflection of what we as a team think is important. And if I can't convince them, I'm probably not going to convince the audience. So try as you might, sometimes you just have to accept that what interests you is not interesting everyone else. It can mean, though, that you've got to keep working on that story, keep finding the piece of information that will be the aha moment for everyone else. Thanks for your question. And here's how you can ask me anything. Email us, investigators@cbc.ca, or reach out to us on Twitter @Swain Diana. We often focus on the work of investigative journalists, but sometimes major investigative stories get their start another way, such as Bridgegate. This week saw the culmination of that major political scandal. Two of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie's former senior people were sentenced to jail time. In 2013, they ordered 2 of 3 lanes of the George Washington Bridge closed, ostensibly for a traffic study. But it was really to get back at the local mayor who didn't support Christie's re-election plans. The closures led to massive traffic jams, slowed emergency vehicles, and even hampered the search for a missing little boy. Many believe Christie knew all about it, which he's denied. Still, some speculate the lingering scandal hurt his run for the White House. Once it got rolling, the story was covered by all the big news media outlets, but it started with a column by the Road Warrior, a traffic reporter for a New Jersey newspaper. He wanted to know who ordered the traffic study. At first, he didn't get an answer, thought he would just forget about it, but he followed up, leading to one of the biggest political stories in years. Sometimes the best part of the story isn't evident right away. It's what you find when you keep asking. I'm Diana Swain. We are The Investigators.